In this video, we're going to be discussing fungi. As you can see, we're in my living room, my kitchen. So um, there we go. So you should have your books open to page 100. We're going to be covering pages 100 through 103. When you're done with this section, you will be responsible for the review questions on page 104 and 105. So we learned all about protists in this last section, and now we're learning about fungus. And you guys need to take notes, turn these notes in, and you will be responsible for those notes. Very good, let's start. So what I want you guys to see first is that when we're talking about fungi, this is what you'll probably be used to seeing it as, a mushroom. That's basically what people think of when they think of fungus, or fungi are mushrooms. You have a cap, you have gills, that's where the spores are released from. And you actually have the spores, and you have the stalk, and we're going to get into that in a minute, and then you have what's inside there, and they're called hyphae. And underneath here, the hyphae form mycelium, and we'll go through all that as well. What you guys need to do is pause this, and you're going to actually illustrate this. On a test, you'll be responsible for labeling all this stuff like normal. So go ahead and pause it, make this illustration, and then come back. Alright, since you're back, let's go ahead and we'll keep going. So when we think of fungi, we think that they are consumers, meaning they cannot make their own food, they can't move, and in order to get food, this is where it's kind of gross, if you will, they actually secrete juices onto a food source, and then they absorb those nutrients from their dissolved food. Alright? The next thing about fungi is that they are decomposers, meaning they simply get their food from dead matter. So anytime you see a fungus, it's going to be on something that's dead. Alright? So go ahead and write those notes down. The next thing we're going to see is that, what is a fungi? A fungi is a eukaryotic cell with chains of cells called hyphae. We only see a little bitty part of the fungi. What you see here is just a barely tip. Everything underground is the big part of a fungi. Most of it is underground, known as mycelium, and that is the major body part. That's an important note you guys need to make sure you write down, that we only see a little bit of the fungi. Alright, the next thing we're going to cover is, how do they reproduce? Well, fungi reproduce two different ways. They reproduce asexually and sexually. You'll need to write down those as well. And the first thing we're going to see is that they produce asexually by two different ways. By fragmentation and by budding. Basically, with fragmentation, all they're doing is they're taking that hyphae and it breaks apart and it forms a new one. That's basically, so it's fragmenting. It's breaking apart and forming a new one. The other way, one of the other ways is by budding. And by budding, a parent cell pinches, think of the way bacteria reproduce, kind of pinches and breaks apart, forms a new fungi. And the last way is by spores. When you see a mushroom, you see that cap, and if you look underneath it, there's a bunch of little lines. I described that every year in my yard I get a bunch of fungi, a bunch of mushrooms. You pick them up and they're this line by these, they look like little slits. Those are called the gills. And within the gills are spores. Basically, with spore reproduction is that the hyphae form a stalk and they release the spores into the wind. And if a couple of these spores happen to hit good ground, they will form new fungi. So that's the asexual reproduction. There's also sexual reproduction. Basically, with sexual reproduction, you guys need to write this down. In sexual reproduction, two hyphae form. So those hyphae are those little strings of cells. Two hyphae form, and they join and they grow and they form a stalk. Think of a mushroom. That is basically, when you see a mushroom, is basically the sexual organ of a mushroom. It's nothing more than like a sexual organ. So they actually make this mushroom, and then they form a diploid cell in there. So they form in diploid cells. If you remember those zygotes, they form diploid cells and haploid cells. So two haploids come together and they form a diploid. Then you guys are going to research a process called meiosis. And meiosis, they splits again and they become haploids. Those haploids form the spores. They then release, and then they are making new cells. So you definitely need to write down those notes. Meiosis. You're going to have to know that. You're going to have to research it on your own, find out what it is, and illustrate it for me. On a test, you'll be giving a blank form and say, "Show me meiosis." Use your notes. Show me meiosis, and you're going to have to do that. So I hope you're paying attention. We're going to learn about 4 different types of fungi, and you're going to write down those notes as well. The first one we're going to learn, probably the second to the most common one you'll see, is called a zygote fungi. And basically it's bread mold. When you think of zygote fungi, you think of bread mold. Basically, these guys live in soil, and every once in a while they'll catch on something like bread mold. Those of you that did the science project, several of you said you had a problem getting your bread mold to grow. Well, that's because you couldn't get that nice zygote fungi to form. So they live in soil and they are decomposers, and then you guys will do some research to figure out how bread mold is actually made. The next thing we're going to research is sac fungi. They're actually named sac fungi because of their shape. Kind of looks like a sack. Sac fungi are like yeast for making bread or beer. They're single cell. Most of them are single cell. This guy happens to be multi-cell. You can tell because you can actually see them. They're single celled. Most of them are single celled. And then they actually, inside that single cell, they form a little sac. Spores develop, and then they release, make new ones. And that's a sac fungi. Probably the most common, no, this is not in Mario, the most common would be the club fungi. And like we mentioned before, the only part you see is the reproducing part. Everything else is underground. These guys, this club fungi, is important for rotting wood. If these guys weren't around, every time a tree fell, it would never rot. These fungus, they are floating around through spores. They land on a rotting tree and then they decompose it, make nutrients for the soil, and so forth. So they're extremely important. Now let's talk about the relationships, the partnerships. There's 2 different partnerships I want you guys to know. The first is this mycorrhiza. Fungi and plants and soil work together. Basically what happens is you have the fungus, it breaks apart the soil and it gets nutrients from the soil, and then in process it actually helps the plant because it's breaking up a lot of the soil. It gets nutrients to the roots very easily. So that's one. It's called mycorrhiza. You guys will have to know that and give me examples of that. And the other we're going to research is lichen. Now, something that I found in my research I didn't know was that this is not this green thing you see. That's not lichen. Lichen is the partnership. This is fungi and algae forming together. These guys work together and they help break down rock. The algae feeds the fungi and the fungi feeds the algae. You guys will have to do research on there. Basically, that's it. So there's your fungi. Hope you guys took notes. You are responsible for all the pages between 101 and 105, and we'll do some more research together. Thanks, guys.